The train whistle cut through the afternoon like a blade, sharp, final, the kind of sound that marks endings. Wednesday, September 1882. Millwood, Montana Territory, where arrivals are noted and departures remembered. She stepped off the platform last. Single bag, blue dress wrinkled from 3 days of travel, hands loose at her sides, chin level, the way a woman holds herself when she's decided in advance not to fall apart. At the far end, a man with a paper in his coat, the look of someone who'd been rehearsing bad news so long the rehearsing had made it worse by the time he spoke. Half the town was watching. "I can't do this." Loud enough to carry, which was the whole of the cruelty. The platform cleared around her. People finding sudden business elsewhere, the mercy of averted eyes. She remained, bag at her feet, the town spread out before her, no clear answer to what came next. Across the street, a carpenter came out of the hardware store, sawdust on his sleeve, 2 children waiting at home, 3 years of managing alone. He read the platform, the bag, the straight back, the empty space where a man had just been, and then he crossed the street. Some decisions aren't made in a moment, they're made in 1,000 small choices. This was the first, a stranger, a proposition, a temporary arrangement, until temporary became something else entirely. This is the story of a woman who arrived with nothing but a carpetbag and a spine, and left with everything that actually matters, not because someone gave it to her, but because she was brave enough to stay. The platform stood half empty under a sky that couldn't decide between rain and mercy. Wood planks weathered gray, a water tower casting its shadow long, music, the kind of place where arrivals were noted and departures remembered. The coach from the railhead came in at 2:30. Willa Hartwell was the last one off, 25 years old, single carpetbag, a blue dress that had been pressed before the journey had not survived it. Wrinkled at the elbows, dust at the hem, but her hands hung loose at her sides, and her chin stayed level, the way a woman holds herself when she's decided in advance not to fall apart. Music, not here, not in front of witnesses. Silas Brennan stood at the far end of the platform, 31. Thinning hair he tried to comb over. A paper folded in his coat pocket. Music, the look of a man who'd been rehearsing bad news so long the rehearsing had made it worse. He'd filed the contract 8 months prior through the agency in St. Louis, paid the fee, sent the letter, received her acceptance, music, and spent every day since changing his mind. But he'd written no letter back because a letter would have required courage he didn't possess before witnesses were present. Willett had spent 3 years at the orphanage where she'd grown up, stayed on after aging out, music, taking and mending, saving what she could, waiting for something that looked like a way forward. Music, when the solicitation came, she read it twice, signed her name, spent the last coin she had on the ticket west. Now Silas stood 10 feet away, music, and couldn't meet her eyes. "I can't do this." Loud enough to carry, which was the whole of the cruelty because the platform wasn't empty. Mrs. Campbell stood near the ticket window, adjusting her shawl, pretending not to listen. Mr. Durant from the feed store paused mid-step, bag of grain over his shoulder, and the Whitfield woman, Constance. Always Constance, standing with her daughter near the far bench, watching with the expression of someone witnessing a lesson she'd want to repeat later. By supper half the town would know, by morning the rest would. Willa stood and let Silas finish, hands at her sides, face doing what she needed it to do, which was nothing, music, nothing at all. He waved the agency papers once, not a deed. Everyone on that platform knew a woman was not land, could not be claimed as such, but he held them like a man who wanted the weight of paper behind him. "I thought I could, but I can't." Then he put the papers back in his coat and walked away without looking back because looking back would have required something he didn't have either. The platform cleared around her, people finding sudden business elsewhere. Errands that couldn't wait. The mercy of averted eyes. Willa remained, bag at her feet. The town spread out in front of her. Buildings low and practical. A church spire. The smell of wood smoke and horses and the faint metallic tang of the rail yard. No clear answer to what came next. Across the street, a man came out of Miller's Hardware. Paper bag of fittings in one hand, the other brushing sawdust from his sleeve. 32 years old. Broad in the shoulders the way men get from lifting things that don't cooperate. Carpenter's hands. Scars on the knuckles from work that bites back. Caleb Thorne. Music, he looked like a man who'd carried too much for too long. Long enough that he'd stopped noticing the weight. But he noticed now. Stood on the boardwalk step. Read the platform with the instinct of someone who'd learned to assess situations before entering them. The bag, the straight back, the empty space where a man had just been standing. And then he crossed the street, music, not hurried, but not slow either. Stopped at the bottom of the platform steps. Looked up at, music, her. Caleb Thorne. His voice had gravel in it. From shouting over sawdust or keeping quiet too long. I've got 2 children and a house that needs keeping. I do carpentry work 3 days a week. Mornings you'd have the place to yourself. He held her gaze. It's temporary. Room and board until you've sorted what's next. Willa looked at him, taking measure, the way you assess a beam before trusting weight to it. His boots were worn but maintained. Shirt clean. Hands that knew work. Eyes that weren't asking for anything except an answer. Music, can you cook? I can. Her voice even. Not grateful, not desperate, music, just factual. And I'm not afraid of hard work. Caleb nodded once. Then let's go. She picked up her bag. They walked off the platform together. Behind them the town watched, stored it up for later, the way small places do with anything that breaks routine. Mrs. Campbell would tell her sister over tea, Mr. Durant would mention it at the feed store, and Constance Whitfield would save it for the right moment, when a lesson could be extracted and delivered. But for now, they just watched, the carpenter and the woman from the train, walking down Main Street like it was already decided. The cabin sat at the edge of town, not far, but far enough that you couldn't hear the Saturday night noise from the saloon, or the Sunday morning bells unless the wind carried them right. Music, a split rail fence marked the property line. Modest, maybe 2 acres. A horse in the side pen, brown mare with a white star, lifted her head as they approached, went back to grazing. The house itself was small, single-story, log construction, chimney stone, porch that wrapped halfway around the front, and a step, the bottom one, loose. Willa noted, music, it, didn't comment. Caleb opened the door without ceremony. Welcome to it. Inside the front room was clean in the way of a house managed by a man alone. Functional, music, orderly, nothing soft in it. A workbench along the far wall, tools hanging on pegs, organized by type and size. A wood stove doing steady work, heat without smoke. The kind of maintenance that spoke to someone who understood how things worked. 2 chairs by the stove, handmade, mismatched but sturdy. A table near the kitchen. 4 places. On the shelf above the kitchen window, sat a small sewing basket, wicker with a wooden lid. It had the of something no one had touched in a long time. Something everyone in the house had quietly agreed to leave alone. Dust on the lid, but not on anything around it, which told its own story. Room off the kitchen is yours. Caleb gestured. Your own door. Your own space. Children eat at 6 o'clock. I eat when I'm back. Willa set her bag down. Understood. Finn. Caleb called toward the back of the house. Nothing. Finn. Music, louder. A boy appeared from the rear hallway, 10 years old. His father's build already showing in the shoulders. Music, dark hair that wouldn't cooperate. A face that kept its own counsel. He looked at Willa the way a person looks at something they've seen a version of before and aren't ready to feel differently about. Looked at his father, then turned and went back the way he came. Without a word which said plenty, Caleb's jaw tightened. Released. That's Finn. Noted. Ruby didn't make an entrance so much as she materialized, 6 years, music, old. 1 ribbon tied properly, 1 simply hanging. Standing near the doorway with the full and unguarded attention of a child who hasn't learned to want things quietly. She looked at Willa with her whole face. Willa looked back, even and calm. Music, nothing performed. You hungry? Ruby considered this seriously. a little bit. Come help me find what's in the larder. Music, Ruby came without hesitation. Supper that first night was beans and cornbread, music. And a broth that had no business smelling the way it did, given what the larder held, which wasn't much. Music, dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork that had seen better days, an onion, some questionable carrots, a jar of preserves someone had clearly made themselves. The wax seal still intact, but Willa had learned at the orphanage how to make something from almost nothing. How to coax flavor from bones, stretch meals across days, make do. Music. The smell reached the front room before anyone sat down. Caleb came in from the yard where he'd been checking the mare's water. Stopped just inside the door. Something moved across his face, recognition maybe, or memory. He set it aside. Smells good. It'll do. Finn ate without speaking. Fork to plate, plate to mouth. Eyes on his food. Ruby ate with her gaze moving between her bowl and Willa in rotation, like she was trying to figure out a puzzle, and the answer kept moving. Partway through the meal, Ruby set her spoon down. The last woman who kept house for us burned everything she touched. Music, Ruby. Caleb's voice carried warning. Ruby looked at Willa instead. Undeterred, she did though. Willa kept her eyes on her plate. Burnt beans are a serious matter. I don't take them lightly. Finn's head came up. Just slightly. Music, the corner of his mouth moved. Once. Returned to where it had been. Music, he said nothing more. But when supper was finished, he stayed at the table a little longer than he needed to, whittling a small piece of pine. Before going to bed, Caleb noted that didn't comment. The following morning, Caleb came off the porch at first light. The loose step held solid under his boot. Music, he stopped. Pressed it again. Felt forgive. Found none. Stood there a moment. Then went inside and poured 2 cups of coffee. Left one on the counter near where Willa was working. Music. Nothing said about the step. She said nothing about it either. They drank their coffee in the early quiet. The kind of silence that sits between people who understand that some things don't need acknowledgement. The cold morning settled in around the house. Outside a crow called once, twice. The mare shifted in her pen. And somewhere down the valley, a rooster remembered its job. By midday Wednesday, Willa had taken stock of the house. 3 rooms. The front room with the workbench and stove. The kitchen barely separated. 2 bedrooms off the back hallway. And her room. Smallest. But just a bed and a chest. Music, window facing east, which meant morning light. She could work with that. The linens needed washing. The stove needed proper cleaning. Someone had been letting ash build up, and the pantry shelves wanted organizing. Music, small things. But small things had a way of adding up. She started with the washing, hauled water from the pump, heated it on the stove, found the washing paddle hung on a nail by the back door. Ruby appeared at her elbow. Can I help? You can stir. Gently, Ruby took the paddle in both hands. Serious as a judge, stirred like the fate of nations depended on it. Willa watched from the corner of her eye, 6 years old, and already trying to be useful. All the understanding that help was a form of belonging. You're good at that. Ruby beamed. Thursday morning brought rain. Not heavy, just persistent. The kind that makes everything damp and gray. Willa worked inside, organized the pantry, music, mended a tear in one of Finn's shirts, made bread dough and set it to rise. Music, Ruby followed her from room to room, asking questions, telling stories, the way children do when they've decided someone is safe. About the chickens Mrs. How kept, about her friend Emily who wouldn't share the jump rope, about how the sky looked before storms. Willa listened, responded, asked her own questions, and slowly, without meaning, music, to Ruby was claiming her, the way children claim the people who pay attention. Friday, the 5th day, Finn tested her, not dramatically, just a quiet refusal. She'd asked him to bring in firewood before supper. He'd said he would, then didn't. Sat at the table with his whittling knife, working a piece of cedar, waiting to see what she'd do. Willa appeared in the doorway of the back room. Finn, the wood. Music, he looked up, met her gaze. I was getting to it. I know. Get to it now, please. Not angry, not impatient, music, just clear. He looked at her, really looked, searching for something. Whatever he found made him stand. He brought the wood in, stacked it by the stove without complaint. She thanked him plainly, went back to the kitchen. Music, from his workbench, Caleb had heard it. He set his plane down, stood in the quiet for a while before picking it back up. The days found their shape after that. Finn began staying at the table after meals, whittling or reading, present in a way he hadn't been. Ruby followed Willa from room to room, helping where her hands could reach, watching carefully where they couldn't. And Caleb started coming home at the same hour every evening, which hadn't been the case before. Before had been whenever the work ran long, or when he didn't want to face the quiet house alone. But now there was supper at 6 o'clock, music, and Ruby talking about her day, and Finn pretending not to listen but clearly listening. And Willa, music, just there, not filling space aggressively, not performing domesticity like a woman trying to prove worth, just doing what needed doing. Music, with competence and without complaint. It was a gray, unremarkable Monday morning when it happened, September 25th, 12 days since the platform. Music, Ruby was moving through the kitchen in her socks, still warm from sleep, absorbed in some private business that required absolute concentration. Music, she caught her foot on the threshold between the kitchen and the hall, went down hard on both palms. The sound she made was the startled kind, the kind that comes before a child has decided whether this warrants tears. She decided it did. Willa came down to the floor with her before the crying had fully started. Took both small hands in hers. Looked at the palms, music, red, not bleeding, but the shock hurt more than the skin. She held them warm and firm, music, not making a fuss, not going anywhere. And Ruby, without meaning to say anything at all, said the word that was simply true, Mama. It went into the cabin and did not leave. Willa's hands stayed where they were, one breath, music, no more. Then she gathered the girl in, held her until the crying ran itself out, calm, music, and certain, giving no outward sign of what the word had done to the room, to her. Caleb was in the bedroom hallway. He'd heard, stood with one hand on the frame, looking at the hallway floor, not at music. Them. Something was happening in him, and he kept his eyes away from it, because some things change the moment you look at them straight. At the table, Finn had gone still, 10 years old. And he knew exactly what he'd heard, exactly what it meant. Something in his face that had been shut a long time was working slowly toward open. Not today, but the lock was turning. Caleb went back into his room, sat on the edge of the bed, hand flat on his knee, stayed there while the morning moved quietly around the house. That afternoon, Willa walked into town for flour. Music, the general store sat halfway down Main Street, false front, wide windows, music, bell over the door that announced arrivals. She went in. The place smelled like leather and coffee and wood polish. Barrels lined one wall, dry goods on shelves, a counter at the back where Mr. Carson kept the till. Music, he looked up when she entered. Mrs. He paused, uncertain of that title. Miss Hartwell. Miss Hartwell, what can I do for you? 5 pounds of flour and salt if you have it. He moved to fill the order. The bell over the door rang again. Constance Whitfield entered, mid-50s, dressed well for Millwood, which meant carefully, hair pinned in a style that required effort. The posture of a woman who decided long ago that presentation was half the battle. She moved to the counter, stood beside Willa with the warm and practiced manner of a woman delivering concerns she'd prepared at home. Miss Hartwell. Mrs. Whitfield, I wanted to speak with you. About appearances. Music, Willa waited. People are saying things about you and Mr. Thorne, music, about the nature of the arrangement. The arrangement is room and board in exchange for housekeeping. Yes, but people talk and children can be confused about what an arrangement is and what it isn't. She chose her words the way you choose tools for what they would do. Willa set her coins on the counter. One at a time. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Whitfield. But the children aren't confused and neither am I. I'm only saying that situations have a natural shape when left alone and confusion comes from giving the wrong idea. The only idea I'm giving is that work earns keep and respect goes both ways. Constance's smile tightened. Of course, I just thought as someone who's been here longer I should mention it. She left without buying anything. Willa took her flour and salt, walked home 25 years old, and she'd been assessed by women with prepared voices in enough rooms that she'd built a durable patience for it. The patience of a woman, music, who knew that another person's measure of her was not the truth. She stood at the kitchen window with her hands on the sill, looked at the yard, the line of pines beyond it, music, the cold flat sky longer than she needed to. Then she started supper. One evening she read to Ruby from the book of stories on the shelf, doing the voices without embarrassment. The Wicked Witch cackled. The princess spoke with hope. Ruby pressed against her side. The complete trust of a child who'd made a decision and saw no reason to revisit it. Finn sat at the far end of the room, something in his hands. He didn't look up. He didn't leave. And Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway, coffee cup in hand, watching his children, watching the woman who'd arrived with nothing but a bag and a backbone starting to settle into his home like she'd been meant for it all along. That evening Caleb was at the stove checking the fire. She was finishing the dishes. Without looking up from the flames he asked, "Everything all right today?" She kept her hands in the basin. Thought about it honestly. Yes. He nodded once at the fire.